I'm Jacqueline Luqman with the Real News Network, coming to you from Baltimore. Despite a national outcry and increased attention, police killings of African American men continue to roil communities across the country. Here in Maryland, the recent death of Anton Black, a 19-year-old former high school track star, has brought controversy and turmoil to the small Eastern Shore town of Greensboro, Maryland, where he lived. In September, police chased him to his mother's home where 2 officers and 1 civilian tasered him, wrestled him to the ground, and it's during that arrest that Anton Black died. The Medical State Examiners Board ruled his death an accident, and that decision has caused controversy because the Real News consulted an independent pathologist that determined that Black's death was the result of positional asphyxiation, meaning that his death was not an accident. But the Real News investigation did not stop there. Our reporters Taya Graham and Janis looked into other cases of police-involved deaths that had also been ruled accidents, and what they found is the topic of our discussion today. So thank you, Taya and Stephen, for joining me today on the Real News Network.
Thank you for having us.
This case is not only troubling, but it turns out it's not the only case like it that you have examined. But let's start with the case of Anton Black. Give me a little overview of what happened in this case.
Certainly. Well, Anton Black, as you mentioned, was a 19-year-old with an incredibly bright future. He wasn't only just a track star and a football star, but he was a budding model. He had actually just walked the catwalk in New York's Fashion Week. So what happened was a white woman called 911 and said that she saw Anton abducting a boy. It turns out the boy that Anton was walking down the street with was his 12-year-old cousin. Whether or not they were roughhousing a bit or horseplaying, there is obviously this woman saw it in a particular way. She chose to call the police. When the police arrived, Officer Tom Webster was on the scene. Officer Tom Webster's interaction with Anton made him start to run away. Once he started running, another police officer, not in uniform, started chasing him. And that's when Anton got really scared and started running home to his mother. There were also a man on a motorcycle who was a civilian who joined into the chase, and which is something that's actually not uncommon on the Eastern Shore for citizens to get involved with policing, but we can talk about that another time. But for Anton, this all started with a white woman who called 911 on him. He was chased, tasered, and it led to his death. And the state medical examiner ruled this an accident.
So how did the state medical examiner's office justify ruling this young man's death an accident?
Well, basically the medical examiner, which we should note took 4 to 5 months to come up with this conclusion, used an underlying abnormality in his heart, which not something that had caused any problems for him previously, or there was even any medical fact about, because actually he had electrocardiogram and it had not come up. So the medical examiner said that he had this underlying aberration, anatomical aberration, that prompted him to basically die out when he was in the process of being arrested. Medical examiner also pointed to, a psychological condition, which really had nothing to do with bipolarity, I guess, right?
Yes, it was bipolar disorder.
So really using those 2 things. So it really doesn't make any sense because as the medical pathologist that we consulted, Dr. Cyril Weck said, this had been something he'd lived with his whole life. I mean, as Taya pointed out, he was a track star.
Yes.
So obviously if he had a heart problem, which is not what this really is, it's just an aberration, right? And there's a big distinction there. It's not like something that would be known as a medical condition, just that his heart is shaped a little differently.
Right,
than what
it's
would be
just
standard.
a little bit different from the standard, just a slight aberration,
Deviation,
which
basically.
doesn't mean that it's actually pathological, that it would have caused him any trouble throughout his life.
In his life.
So that this raises the question. The term underlying heart condition, it doesn't mean what we think it means, does it?
No.
It does not mean that Anton Black was sick and suffering from a heart condition that would have taken his life or ended his life anyway.
Right.
Yeah.
So if that is the case, can it be said that if Anton Black had not had this interaction the way it happened with the police, even with this underlying heart condition, would he still be alive?
Well, yes, because so what we did is we consulted an outside medical pathologist, Dr. Cyril Weck, who is pretty famous for he worked on the Kennedy assassination, and he's been a president of the American Association of Pathologists. So he's a pretty famous guy. And what he said was that this had nothing to do with a heart condition. This had to do with something called positional asphyxiation, which, right now we're going to be showing the video, which is from the body cam of one of the officers. And as you can see, the officer is laying across Anton's body. And Anton is face down on the ground and has this 250 or I don't know, but a fairly large
Very large man. So positional asphyxiation, and this is what we learned from Dr. Cyril Wecht, is when someone is laying face down on the ground and someone else is laying on top of them. Sometimes it's also called traumatic asphyxiation or riot crush, because it's seen when there is a riot and movement of people and someone gets trampled and people step on top of them. So what happens is the person is on the ground and another body is placed on top of them and their lungs become compressed. They're unable to breathe. And you would be surprised how little time it takes for you to be deprived of oxygen for it to cause a cardiovascular event or your death.
So let's listen to what Dr. Weck said specifically about Anton's case.
Yes.
I strongly disagree with the final diagnosis that the cause of death was a coronary artery anatomical aberration. That defect had been present in Mr. Black's life, his entire life, and had not produced any problems to my knowledge from reading the reports. How convenient that he should have died from that defect at the time that he is being restrained in a position that has been barred, banned, and prohibited from various national police agencies throughout the country and elsewhere in the world. This is a classical case of positional asphyxiation in which somebody is placed face down and then someone leans on his back, presses down on his back, and he's tasered after several minutes, and then he goes limp. That's a classical case of positional asphyxiation.
So I want to go back to positional asphyxiation because this is fascinating to me. If we understand that in a riot situation, in a crowd situation, if someone falls on the ground and other people step on them or other people accidentally fall on them, that weight on a person's body can cause death.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
Then how is that not carried over? How is that not the same phenomenon in a situation where a teenage boy has a 250-pound adult man lying on his back?
Well, the reason why it's not the same phenomenon is because police officers are involved. It's that simple. One of the problems is that in the medical examiner's office, when they are doing the autopsy, very often the same police officers who were involved in the incident that led to the death are in the autopsy room with the medical examiner.
Is that normal? Is that procedure? Is that unusual?
Well, according to A. Dwight Pettit, who's an attorney who also has litigated one of these cases of positional asphyxiation, it is very common, and we can listen to him talk about it in the clip we have right here.
The police officers are right in the room. The police officers, I've seen in case after case where the police officers go into the autopsy, and I think they tend to intimidate the doctors.
So it's common, but is it right?
That's a great question.
That's a great question. I would have to give this as my opinion as someone who's investigated these stories. I don't think it's right. Because when you have a police officer guiding the autopsy, it can't help but influence the way the doctor is perceiving the evidence in front of them. And I think a good example of this is in Anton Black's case, because they said it was an underlying heart condition exacerbated by his bipolar disorder. If you had that body in the room and you were examining it, there is no way in doing an autopsy you could possibly know if someone had a mental health condition like bipolar disorder unless they had medicine in his system for it, which he did not.
Yeah.
And so that gives a sign that the officers were leading the medical examiner to the conclusion that the officers wanted to see.
And why this is so critical, if you look at the coverage of Anton's death, you'll see once the medical examiner concludes it's an accident, all the media starts reporting accident, accident. So every headline you see accident, and suddenly there's no real imperative for the prosecutors to bring any sort of case against the police officers because it's an accident. I mean, the medical examiner plays a critical role in this, and if the police are influencing them, it's the dilemma of police investigating themselves, right? So you don't really have an impartial body here, and yet it's critical to what happens later on.
So this is an interesting perspective because I don't think we usually think about the role of the medical examiner in police-involved deaths. But here we have a case, and not just one case, several cases, and probably more than what you two have investigated, where biased police, rather, are influencing what is supposed to be the unbiased entity in the process, which is the medical examiner's office. So that leads us to the question, who appoints the medical examiner? Where does the medical examiner come from?
So there's a board made up of a couple prominent physicians and the Baltimore City Health Commissioner, and it's called a Board of Pathology or something. It's a very small, obscure board, not elected, not appointed by anyone that other than I think the governor or even themselves. And they are the people who sort of make the decision who to hire to be the chief medical examiner. So there's really, and this is very different from other jurisdictions where what you have known as a coroner system, where a coroner is elected by the population, just like a state's attorney. Like, you know, Marilyn Mosby's Baltimore prosecutor, she's elected. Many states have a coroner who is an elected official. It doesn't really have to be a medical pathologist. But here we have a system where it's all centralized, and I think we could safely say an obscure board appoints him. So the accountability mechanisms are absent from this situation.
So even in light of the kind of nebulous nature of the medical examiner being appointed, and the exposure that these questionable findings from the medical examiner's office is highlighting, what recourse do citizens have when they now question the reputation? They now question the motives of the medical examiner in these cases. What can citizens do?
That's really the problem here. There is such a thing as a civilian review board, for example, in Baltimore City, which is a body that's connected to the Office of Civil Rights and Wage Enforcement. And if someone has experienced police brutality, discourtesy, they can file a complaint with this civilian review board. However, once the civilian review board makes a recommendation, they can recommend that an officer be disciplined or even be fired. They pass that on to the police department, but the police department has no obligation to do anything with that recommendation. So when it comes to police accountability, our citizens really have trouble holding them accountable.
With the medical examiner's officer, you can appeal a ruling, I think, for like 60 days. But in terms of the actual board, the only really way people have to fight back with this or to question it is through litigation. And in the case of litigation, in terms of some of the other cases we looked at, they went and they deposed the pathologist and actually questioned them. And we have a little shot here, or I'm sorry, a little piece of sound from Dwight Pettit, where he talks about what happened in those depositions.
When we took the depositions of the doctors in the West case, they really did not back their own conclusions. When we got to the conclusions, well, I don't remember, or I'm not sure, I didn't really examine this, I didn't do. Well, this is basically them saying, hey, there was another factor involved, which I don't want to get into. The factor is that 5 or 6 police officers were sitting there while you were doing the autopsy, telling you what they wanted you to find.
So as you can see, he felt from talking to these medical examiners that they were influenced by police and sort of were saying, I didn't know what happened, or I don't remember what happened, which is very odd. So you're right, there's really no mechanism for people other than litigation, which can be expensive, and you can't always get a lawyer, right? So it really comes down to litigation is the only way right now to hold them accountable.
For example, in the case of Tawanda Jones, her brother, Tyrone West, died in police custody. She felt that the medical examiner, our medical examiner in the state of Maryland, who ruled this death by dehydration and underlying heart condition, She thought that instead that she believed the witnesses who talked about this incredibly physical and brutal interaction of the police officers and her brother. So she not only paid for an autopsy for someone outside of the state of Maryland, she actually had to pay to have her brother's body exhumed.
And my attorneys, they went and got their own doctor, their own forensic person, and his name was Dr. Mangan. He concluded that my brother was murdered. Second person, reliable source, concluded.
Was it positional asphyxiation?
Positional asphyxiation. And then I went a step further. I'm like, you know what, Tyrone West is going to have the final word. You know, even through his death. I paid $50,000 to have my brother's body dug up. So we had to go through all this pain of having him pulled out the ground, not to be back with his family, as if that was humanly possible. But the torture and pain that we went through that I felt was very important. This doctor, Dr. Shaker, concluded the same thing, a whole different doctor.
So just going into litigation is not the only thing that these families have to go through. Having to exhume her brother's body.
That is not inexpensive.
That's not inexpensive.
And it's also emotionally traumatic.
Also just this incredibly re-traumatizing process for the entire family.
So I think you raise an issue for me that is a bit larger. I want to step back from just these two cases because in both of these instances, these deaths were ruled accidental because of underlying heart conditions. Right. When we look at the nature of policing in Baltimore and in many cities around the country, we see a disparity in how the police are used, how they're deployed, and how they treat, how they interact with citizens in different communities. The second case that you mentioned, Tyrone West,
yes.
I'm familiar with his sister. So I know that Mr. West was a black man. Mr. West's sister is a black woman. I understand also that in Baltimore, the cases of accidental deaths involving the police overwhelmingly involve people of color, black men and women, and overwhelmingly poor people. So I'm going to ask a loaded question of both of you, and I understand you might not be able to give an expert answer,
okay.
But here's where I just want your opinion. If these accidental deaths during these interactions with the police were happening in wealthier, whiter neighborhoods in Baltimore or anywhere else around the country, do you think there would be more scrutiny, not just on the police, but on the practices of the medical examiner's offices? And would citizens be given a more direct path to challenge these kinds of findings and to have better outcomes and more transparency in the system? Stephen, you first.
Yeah, well, when we were covering zero tolerance, which was Baltimore City's experiment with mass arrest, mass incarceration, where they arrest 100,000 people a year, and 90% of the people who were arrested were African American. We used to have this saying like, well, this would never happen in Roland Park, which is a predominantly white neighborhood. Like, give it the Roland Park test. Could you arrest a 7-year-old child in Roland Park? Could you go out in the street and drag people out and take their belongings, like the Gun Trace Task Force in Roland Park? And the answer is absolutely not. So if you look at the Justice Department report, it said racist and unconstitutional policing targeted primarily at poor black neighborhoods. Look at Marilyn Mosby's decision just recently to stop prosecuting marijuana possession cases. Why? Because all of the enforcement had been targeted at poor black communities, West Baltimore, East Baltimore. It is absolutely an instrument of race in this city, and it has been, and it's provable just by statistics. You know, the reason behind that is very complex, and maybe simple, but complex. But absolutely, none of this would ever happen in a Roland Park or Hamden. It never has happened.
You know, when you were talking about would this happen in a white community, in a more affluent community, my first thought was of this young white skater who was down at the Inner Harbor. And Officer Riviera encountered this young man, was incredibly discourteous to him, and then put him in a chokehold.
Threw him to the ground.
And threw him to the ground.
Sit down. What the hell? Sit down! Dude, sit down, I'm not a dude!
Aaron, sit down.
You're damn right you're calling your mother.
Dude, you wanna take my skateboard? I didn't do anything, dude.
Hey, call me dude one more time. Are you from the county or something?
So Officer Rivera lost his job with incredible alacrity.
Really?
Yes.
Yeah, and it went national.
And this story became a national story because it was a white child, a white teenager child at our Inner Harbor in Baltimore who was treated in this way. How often have we heard about black children, young black men and women being placed in chokeholds, being treated discourteously, being told to get off a corner, and it does not get national attention? They do not receive any sort of justice in that police officer losing their job or losing pay or being held accountable. So to me, it's very obvious. Stephen mentioned zero tolerance. At the height of zero tolerance in Baltimore, let's say 2008, there was over 100,000 arrests in Baltimore City. This city has 630,000 people in it, in a majority black city. And not only that, is that we know that there are certain neighborhoods that weren't being targeted for these arrests.
From the
Justice Department report. So we know that these incredible amount of arrests were being targeted against African Americans.
And you know, one thing I think is really interesting about it is that the architect of zero tolerance, Martin O'Malley, went on to run for president and rarely was brought up of what he did, but rarely was he held accountable by the Democratic Party for this atrocity. You know, it really was a human atrocity.
It was a civil rights injustice that
of massive scale.
On a massive
I'm not
scale.
saying this is an opinion. I'm saying what the Justice Department said.
Right. These are documented facts.
Documented facts, and nobody called him out. I mean, maybe once or twice, but he just went running for president as if he was a liberal. Like they would call him
as
like
if he was
he's
progressive.
a classic progressive liberal. Well, this man presided over one of the worst instances of mass incarceration of African Americans in this country's history, I think.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining me today to talk about this really fascinating aspect of not just police corruption, but the entire system of injustice that is the injustice system, examining how the medical examiner's office doesn't do its job for the people, but actually, in too many cases, works for the police, and the turmoil and the pain that causes the citizens of Baltimore and cities all across the country. Taya, Stephen, thank you so much for your work, and thank you for joining me here today at the Real News Network. This is Jacqueline Luqman reporting for the Real News Network.